Hold up. Calvin Harris. Hold up, check this. Hold up. Um, um, yes. This goes tough. This goes tough. This is tough. Okay, okay. Enough Radiohead for the day. Little late night cynicism. Let's get it going. Shame, humiliation, and laughter. In placing shame and humiliation at the center of its educational practices, cynicism brings to expression the tendency of all educational relations to shame and humiliate those who are to be educated. Here, as with aggression, the ancient cynics acted out and thereby drew attention to the inherent humiliations of educational experience. Finding radical potential in actuating in actuating what some might prefer to deny. Diogenes actively ridiculed those who would have him be their teacher. According to one account, when someone expressed a wish to study philosophy, Diogenes he gave them a fish to carry and told him to follow in his footsteps. Ashamed and perhaps a little perplexed, the man threw it away. When Diogenes came across him some time later, Diogenes burst out laughing and said, "Our friendship was brought to an end by a fish." Mm. It seems what the would-be disciple failed to understand is that to practice cynicism, one undergoes repeated humiliation. To carry a fish or cheese in different versions of the story would be to act as if one were Diogenes' slave, an unbearable humiliation in an Athenian society. As Stojarek argues, the cynic has a taste for humiliation, understanding that shame is the most intimate social fetter which binds us before all concrete rules of conscience to universal standards of behavior. As a main factor in social conformisms, shame operates as the switch point where external controls are transformed into internal controls. For that reason, shame and humiliation are at that center of a cynic revolt. The cynic was not alone in the deliberate use of humiliation as a spiritual exercise. As Falcold agrees, we can see traces of this cynic game of humiliation in Christian humanity, from cynic humiliation to Christian humility. There is, he claims, an entire history of the disgrace, shame, and scandal through shame, which is very important historically and once again quite foreign to the standard morality of the Greeks and the Romans. Falco argues that it is nevertheless important to distinguish the future Christian humility, which is a mental attitude manifesting itself and testing itself in the humiliation one suffers, from cynic humiliation. The latter can be understood as a game with conventions of honor and dishonor, in which the cynic attempts to escape the order of shame and submission that disgrace enforces. Another way of putting this is to say that the cynic asserts himself or her sovereignty and perverse masterly through these tests of humiliation, whereas Christian humiliation, or rather, humility is a renunciation of oneself. According to Falcout's rendering of what he calls Christian techniques of the self, the more we discover the truth of ourselves, the more we can renounce ourselves. Yeah. Renounce. Let me just make sure I know what that means. Renounce definition. Formally declare one's abandonment. To reject. To refuse. Yeah, that makes sense. The more you understand about yourself, the more you can reject your actions towards yourself, or the actions that you are doing, because you are able to determine whether or not that is yourself. I like that. The Christian self that is the object of so much introspection never appears in its final satisfactory form, which is not to say that it is an illusion. Rather, the Christian self is much too real. It is filled with temptations, appetites, seductions that have to be driven out or brought to harness as a part of Christian duty to discover what one is. Again, despite these points of distinction, it is still difficult to imagine how the Cynic pursuits of penury and humiliation did not, after all, share much in attitude and experience with the Christian ascetic and monk. Uh, ascetic, ascetic, and monk. To counter the overall impression of the Cynics were in a state of pious self-denial. It is worth drawing attention to the role of farce and comedy in Cynic philosophy. Like Cynic shamelessness, Cynic humor was designed to outrage its victims, since outrage expresses the very conventions of that the Cynic seeks to upset. You can underline that. But cynic humor was potentially disarming too. As Bakhtin argues, laughter can serve to demolish distance and undermine hierarchy. Laughter has the remarkable power of marking an object come up close, of drawing it into a zone of crude contact where one can finger it familiarly on all sides, turn it upside down, inside out, peer at it from above, below, break it open, and see its external shell, look into its center, doubt it, take it apart, dismember it, lay it bare, and expose it. Bakhtin is perhaps a little optimistic about the revolutionary potential of laughter, though in Cynic's hands, and combined with the techniques outlined above, its subversive force can well be imagined. Bakhtin associates this kind of laughter with fearlessness, claiming that laughter demolishes a fear and piety before an object, by bringing it close or down to earth, so to speak. Hence, cynic comedy, as it is pictured here, does not simply bring hidden prejudices and comments and commitments to expression, with these appearing as a direct result of its provocations. It is it brings them home because only in the form it reduces them to the less venerable form of the butt of a joke. um, will such objects shed their respectable clothing and submit to investigation? This connection with fearlessness is important, as it emphasizes that cynic laughter was not based in a cozy, comfortable comedy, but was on the verge of becoming decidedly unfunny. Um, Through comedy, the cynic pushes sardonic mirth to the point that it becomes intolerable insolence. Cynic wit always carried with an element is always carried with oh wait. Cynic wit always carried with it an element of danger. Techniques varied by context. Parody, for example, was used by Diogenes to mock the authority of reason. Accordingly, Diogenes mimicked the conventional philosophical form of slyogalism to justify theft, where the butt of the joke is its form, a jarring contrast between the formal protocols of reason and the paradoxical cynic conclusion it leads to. Crucially, cynic humor involves the audience it berates, since it does not explain itself and requires the audience to fill in the gaps. The audience must supply an understanding of the norms that are being subverted in order to get to that joke. If I ever made it in like some sort of comedic role, like in a future thing, and then like I had someone talk to me about like, oh, what makes a good joke, or yada yada yada, how did you get inspired? I'd probably say something like really ironic or something like that, maybe something sarcastic, but then I would get serious and then I'd say, oh, I read this book and then it said that. The cynics base their humor off of subjecting or subversing the what is normal. Like we have our own comfortable, cozy storm of comedy, but taking risks and going against the grain is what the cynic sort of philosophy is all about. And with that comes danger, and I think that's what you kind of got to find the line, right? Unruly disciples. The educational reach of cynicism clearly exceeds the laughter as well as the deliberate aggression and humiliations inflicted by Diogenes and on his contemporaries. When Cynic philosophy was not directly exemplified through the life of a Cynic practitioner, it was conveyed through brief anecdotes, recollected gestures and retorts, ironic encounters, and witty remarks. Open to alteration, these quips were designed to be a portable and memorable as jokes. This accounts for the endurance of cynicism in the absence of cynic theory. By contrast to other philosophical schools that bequeathed relatively stable doctrines or teachings, cynic sayings were passed on by means sharply contrasted to those of the dogmatic philosophical schools, whose transmission consisted, to quote Foucault, in reactualizing a forgotten and misunderstood core of thought in order to make it the point of departure and the source of authority. It was not a matter of defining oneself in relation to what a figure such as Aristotle or Plato had originally said, for instance. Cynics had a very different relationships to their predecessors. Episodes from the lives of past cynics were recalled, not because these episodes and their doctrinal content had been forgotten. Rather, they were recalled because today's philosophers might no longer be equal to these examples, owing to some sort of decline, enfeeblement, or decadence that had diluted our capacity for cynicism. Past cynics were remembered to provoke present actors to reconsider their conduct and perhaps to enable the strength of conduct exemplified in the actions of past cynics to be restored to those lacking courage. As explored in the next chapter, attempts to live up to the Cynic philosophy were many and various and always very partial. Yeah. Oh, this is a missed opportunity. Check it. Let's go. So God tier. So God tier. Yotsubara. The goat. Love of my life. Don't hurt me. Right? Chapter 4, Fear the Mob. Antique and medieval idealizations. Diogenes accumulated disciples by accident and retained them only as long as they would not be shaken off. This foreground a very different understanding of the relationship between philosophical teacher, and disciple. It testified to the presence of humiliation, rejection, and aggression at the center of the teaching relation. This reflected the treatment Diogenes apparently received at the hands of Antisthenes, pupil of Socrates and a proto-Cynic, who was notoriously hostile to his would-be pupils and beat Diogenes with his staff for coming too close. There were variations on the theme. Crates, famously converted Myrtocles, Myrtrocles, Myrtroclus to cynicism with a well-timed and kindly fart. Bruh, yeah, yep, I'd I'd go on any side where there was a fart. Laertes gives the name of about half a dozen members of Diogenes' little clan of associates, some by their nicknames, suggestingly they were well-known eccentrics. In addition to Crates, who is by far the most famous, Monimus of Syracuse, is is worth mention since he appears to further extend Diogenes' hostility to the pretensions of philosophy. It is claimed that Monimus never spoke a word to match the saying, "Know thyself," nor such familiar watchwords. From the Greek philosophical tradition, no, the squalid mendicant surpassed them all, for he declared all human superstition superstition, superstition to be an illusion. Apparently, Monimus was suspicious of education in all its forms, declaring that it was better to lack sight than education. For under one affliction you fall to the ground, in another a deep underground. hostile to its conventional understandings of education, dismissive of hanger-ons. Clinic teaching was not modeled on the life of study, but on the life of provocations and bowel movements. If it had a philosophy of education, this philosophy was impoverished and scatological, designed to transgress our basic assumptions of what education should look and feel like. Given its attachment to the brief earthly existence of each scurrilous cynic, rather than to a doctrine or text that ensures continuity across generations, the descent of cynicism is erratic and episodic. The history of cynicism is complicated too by the fact that the name is itself unreliable. To assemble a history around this term, to collect together all historical fragments and references of the word cynic, cynical, and cynicism, is to restrict that history to a word that has already been so much abused and distorted. It might be better indeed to assemble a history of cynicism around a broader set of militant themes. This would be a history of forms, modes, styles of life, rather than a history of philosophy in the more typical sense. It might contain a little or no reference at all to the word cynicism, but such a history remains to be told, although this book stays fixated on the term, on its gradual adjustment, and is for that reason limited by its concern with everything that has adopted the name cynic. The point of focus is to explore just exactly why that term was produced in such a way as to remain intrinsically unreliable and evasive. Hold up. Hmm. All right. Next section. Realized cynic. It has been argued that the history of cynicism is one in which an opposition is repeatedly played out between true and false, or venerable and based cynicisms. Venerable cynicism have origins that always remain just out of reach. They are beyond reach in the sense that they are accessible only secondhand, but also in the sense that Diogenes, the prototypical reference point, was not the first cynic. Even in antiquity, commentators suspected that cynicism antedated the Athenians and could be extended back to the time before Hercules, son of Zeus. This linkage back to the Greek pantheon, to the deities rather than historical figures, might sound like a step too far, but this connection could be intrusive if those deities are understood to reflect early Greek sensibility for a form of wisdom, of cunning intelligence. The 4th century Greek philosophy subsequently turned its back on and lost. Perhaps only Cynic philosophy carried forward the canny wisdom of the gods, maintaining in its impoverished Cynic lifestyle some appreciation of the situated craftiness of those deities who operated within a world that was not yet fully formed, who lived in a context where objects and relations between objects had yet to stabilize. The gods, like the Cynics, lived by their wits. Cynicism can also be traced back to their earlier forms in Greek ethnology. 6th and 5th century Greek and ethnographers recounted tales of idealized barbarian races, noble, one-eyed griffin-plagued peoples, and justice-loving, long-lived dog-headed creatures. Yo, that is probably like a really sick verse in like a Midwest emo song. Greek ethnographers recounted tales of idolized barbarian races, noble, one-eyed griffin-plagued people, and justice-loving, long-lived dog-headed creatures. That's cool. That rolls off the tongue. They use the outsider perspective of these races offered as a ploy or device to safely reflect on more civilized creatures. When dealing with Diogenes, in many respects also considered to be a barbarian character from the edges of the Greek world, many commentators would idealize him in a similar way. They would make use of Diogenes as a foreign character who could be put to work offering an external point of view. Within such accounts, it was necessary to purge his portrait of any features that might shock or keep off potential followers. In that form, Diogenes could be safely deployed as a cultural cynic, critic. In that form, Diogenes could be safely deployed as a cultural critic. It is necessary, in other words, for the first authors who described Cynic practices and who gave an account of its key players to debunk certain aspects of Cynic tradition and find its qualities elsewhere. Curiously, the descent of Cynicism in retention depended on its efforts to expel Cynic and his mode of existence from the honorable and recognized philosophical field. This act of repulsion recuperated Cynic philosophy by referring it to a universally valid cynicism, which might be integrated with other philosophies and points of view by an idealized cynicism and that sidestepped the most uncomfortable teachings of Diogenes and his life in the barrel. The educated and the cultured would claim cynicism for their own setting and train a series of maneuvers that would transform Cynic philosophy almost beyond recognition. Oh, Jesus. An early example of Cynic co-option can be found in Stoics philosophy. Stoic philosophers were determined to connect their 3rd century BCE founder Zeno the Cittim to Socrates. This resulted in the proposed succession which ran Socrates, Antisthenes, Diogenes, Crates, Zeno, where Diogenes served as the crucial link that authenticates the tradition of Stoic philosophy, affirming its Stoic pedigree. Echoes of this Stoic co-option can still be found in contemporary scholarship, which reads cynicism through the self-sufficient pleasure regulating. Ooh, there was like a word that I should remember. I think it starts with an A. Hold on, let me. The word for it. Hedonistic is the word I was looking for. The decline of cynicism can apparently be understood through a similar lens as the necessary replacement of laudable but basic Cynic philosophy with a more sophisticated Stoic alternative. Hence the claim that the Cynics were raising serious problems, even if they gave unsatisfactory answers, leaving it to the Stoics to take forward their investigations or the following argument. With the flowering of Stoicism and Epicureanism in the next generation, cynicism ceased to offer an ethical option powerful enough to withstand the more complex attractions of these rival philosophers, who reinterpreted and incorporated its most effective contributions to ethics. This leads to the subsequent claim that it was only once cynicism had been ousted from the mainstream of Hellenistic philosophy that it degenerated into popular moralizing, satirical commonplace, and Charlton Street preaching. Here, then, we encounter an evaluative framework in which cynicism just about retains its dignity so long as it maintains association with the mainstream of Hellenistic philosophy. Only once the connections only once that connection was lost did it degenerate into the form of popular street philosophy. So sad. Mental frame is remarkably enduring to the gather up of a few other examples. In the influential 1937 study, Dudley argued that the persuasive charm of a figure such as Diogenes could not last. The weakness of cynicism lay in or reluctance to give an account of itself. Okay, how many pages have I read so far? Okay, actually not that much, but this will be my last two. Because I kind of want to rest my head for a good 5 minutes. Though Diogenes was an inspirational character, as his direct influence waned, subsequent cynicism degenerated, unable to appeal to the intelligence, they became confined to the life of the street and all its unreflective stupidity. A decade later in the history of Western philosophy, Bertrand Russell declared, what was best in the Cynic doctrine passed over into Stoicism, which was an altogether more complete and well-rounded philosophy. More recently, the entry in the Oxford Companion to Philosophy concludes, many a cynic was doubtless no more than a tramp, and presumably such had nothing to contribute to philosophy. Arguments such as these are troubling. They seem uncomfortably close to those that once sought to dismiss or sanitize cynicism when cynic tramps were a force to be reckoned with. Cynicism survived well into the Roman Empire as a popular philosophy and a scurrilous way of life for the disenfranchised and discontented, given that the reports of its existence were themselves designed to co-opt hard to judge whether or not it was indeed degenerated or simply had been developed or just adjusted to some new circumstances. What we can be sure, however, of is that this street cynicism was an adapted form of philosophy resulting from the process of selective mimesis, cynicism down through minimus that had passed cynicism down through the centuries. We cannot accurately assess the vitality of Cynic philosophy in its street level form because most of the sketches and sayings on which we depend were composed and passed by commentators who were not themselves Cynics and had at best only partial affinity for what Cynic philosophy was attempting to achieve. It does not appear that within in the alienating colossal uh, bureaucratic apparatus of the Roman Empire, whose inner and outer workings an individual could not fathom or influence, cynic sects found a secure footing in popular discontent. As Sadrick observes, moralistic popular resistance again the social and human circumstances of the empire had swelled into a powerful spiritual current. Half a millennium since Diogenes the dogs were howling in its large packs. Given its appeal among the lower order, cynicism of this base type had to be categorically rejected by more cultured commentators if anything was to be rescued for the respectable philosophy. Consequently, it can be encountered only in its distorted form, described by those who were found secret. Cynicism decidedly abhorrent. The examples of Epictetic, oh my god, Epictetus, Epictetus, oh my god, I'm saying it wrong. Lucian and Julian will be considered below. And here's Epictetus, Epictetus. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, a freed slave whose life spanned the first and second centuries and who was proponent after Socrates of the idea that one's philosophy must be lived, was careful to be distinguished of his own nostalgic conception of cynicism from what he called the sad spectacle of today's cynics, who, as one scholar characterized his point of view, mimic their masters in nothing more other than cutting farts. And I guess we'll stop there on a fart. Why not? Yeah, we actually got quite a lot done today, which is very good. Almost 20 pages. I just don't want to read anymore. I'm probably going to read Chainsaw Volume 3, finally getting around to it, just because I'm waiting for my laundry to be done. But with that being said, I'll catch you guys later.